The old shipyard stretched across the lunar surface like a giant's abandoned playground. Broken ships and twisted metal created long shadows in the weak sunlight, their shapes dark against the gray dust. Captain James walked slowly through this maze of forgotten dreams, his boots leaving clear prints in the dust that hadn't been disturbed in decades. His suit radio crackled. "Sir, there's nothing worth saving here," said Lieutenant Mike from the other side of the yard. "These ships are all too damaged to fix." James kept walking. Something pulled him forward, a feeling he couldn't explain. 20 years in space had taught him to trust his gut, and right now it was telling him to keep going. The shipyard had been abandoned during the resource wars 50 years ago. Most people thought it was just full of failed experiments and broken warships, but James had found an old data chip suggesting something more interesting. Something about a secret project that broke all the rules. He stepped around a fallen support beam and stopped. There, half buried in moon dust, sat a ship unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was small, maybe large enough for a crew of 5, with a hull that looked paper-thin. Its engines were arranged in a pattern that made no sense, and its shape seemed to change slightly when he looked at it from different angles. "I found something," he said into his radio. "Section E7. Mike's voice came back confused. "But sir, my scanner shows nothing in E7, just debris." James smiled. That was the first sign this might be what he was looking for. He walked closer to the ship, his hand scanner beeping as it tried to make sense of what it was seeing. According to the readings, the hull was both there and not there at the same time. The energy signatures from the ship pulsed in patterns that shouldn't have been possible. "This is it," he whispered. "The impossible ship." Within an hour, his whole team had gathered around the vessel. Engineers scratched their heads at the readings, and security officers kept their weapons ready, as if the ship might suddenly attack. "It's not safe," said Dr. Wells, the team's chief scientist. "The hull is too thin. One hit from a meteor would tear it apart. And look at these engine readings. They suggest it's trying to be in multiple dimensions at once. It's impossible." "Impossible," James repeated, "or just different." He pressed his gloved hand against the hull. Despite the bitter cold of the lunar night, the metal felt neither hot nor cold. It felt like touching a dream. The ship's computer still worked, its screens lighting up as they cleared away the dust. The programming language it used wasn't like anything in their database, but somehow James could almost understand it. It wasn't written with normal logic. It was written with imagination. "The military will want to scrap it," Mike said, looking worried. "It breaks every safety regulation we have. The design goes against every principle of spacecraft engineering." James nodded slowly, still studying the ship. "That's exactly why we're going to save it. Look at our history. Every great breakthrough came from someone breaking the rules. The first faster-than-light drive, the gravity manipulators, the starfold gates, they all seemed impossible until someone dared to try." He turned to face his team. "I don't think this ship was built wrong. I think it was built to show us a different way of thinking. And right now, with the threats we're facing out there, different thinking is exactly what we need." The others looked uncertain, but James could see curiosity beginning to replace their doubt. This ship was a mystery, a puzzle that made no sense, and humans had never been good at leaving such puzzles unsolved. "Start the recovery process," he ordered, quietly. "Let's get it to my private dock before anyone else realizes what we found." He looked back at the strange vessel, its hull still shifting slightly in his vision. "Something tells me we're going to need this ship, and soon. The universe is too big for just one way of thinking." 3 weeks after finding the strange ship, James stood in his private dock watching Engineer Tom run another system check. The ship hummed softly, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They had cleaned its hull until it shone like liquid silver, but its shape still refused to stay constant in their vision. "I don't understand half of what I'm seeing," Tom said, his eyes fixed on his tablet. "The power systems ignore every law of physics we know. It's like the ship runs on dreams instead of fuel." He tapped the screen several times, frowning. But somehow, everything works perfectly. Alice, their navigator, walked around the ship's exterior for the 100th time. The hull readings keep changing. Sometimes the scanner says it's harder than diamond. Other times it says it's no stronger than paper. She stopped and looked at James. "Are we really going to fly this thing?" James nodded. They had kept the ship secret from military command, knowing they would never approve a test flight of something so strange. But his gut told him they needed to understand this ship, and soon. "Begin launch preparations," he ordered. His small crew, just him, Tom, and Alice, moved quickly to their positions. They had practiced this a dozen times in simulation, but this would be different. This would be real. The ship's interior was as strange as its exterior. The control panels shifted and changed based on what you needed, and the corridors seemed longer or shorter depending on where you were going. They strapped into their seats as the dock's roof opened to reveal the stars. "All systems are, well, they're doing something," Tom reported from engineering. "The power levels make no sense, but they feel right." "Navigation is ready," Alice added, "though I have no idea how this ship plans to move. The engines aren't in any configuration I've ever studied." James placed his hands on the control panel, which warmed slightly at his touch. "Let's find out what this impossible ship can do." The launch was unlike anything they had experienced. Instead of the usual roar of engines and push of acceleration, the ship simply decided to be in space. One moment they were in the dock. The next they were above Earth, moving faster than any conventional ship could manage. "That's impossible," Alice whispered, staring at her readings. "We just covered 5,000 kilometers in less than a second, but I felt no acceleration at all." Tom's voice came over the intercom, excited despite his confusion. "The engines aren't pushing us through space. They're asking space to move around us. It's like the ship doesn't care about the normal rules of movement." James smiled, feeling the ship respond to his lightest touch. It moved like it was part of his thoughts, turning and accelerating in ways that should have torn it apart. They flew past satellites as if they were standing still, curved around the moon in patterns that violated every law of orbital mechanics. Then things went wrong. A piece of space debris, barely larger than a coin, shot toward them at incredible speed. There was no time to dodge. James braced for impact, knowing the paper-thin hull couldn't possibly survive. The debris passed straight through the ship, leaving no damage, not even a scratch. "How?" Tom's voice trailed off as he checked the readings. "The hull. It didn't deflect the debris or tank the hit. It simply convinced physics that there couldn't be a collision. This ship doesn't just ignore the rules, it rewrites them." James felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what they had found. This wasn't just a different kind of ship. It was a different way of thinking about reality itself. And somehow, he knew they had discovered it just in time. As if confirming his thoughts, the ship's sensors suddenly lit up with warnings. Something big was coming. Something that would put their impossible ship to the ultimate test. The warning lights flashed across every screen as massive ships emerged from fold space. They appeared in perfect formation, their black hulls covered in strange markings that seemed to glow with inner light. 12 ships, each one bigger than Earth's largest battleship. "Multiple contacts," Alice said, her voice steady despite the fear showing on her face. "Their energy readings are off the charts. Nothing in our database matches their signature." The largest ship, shaped like a blade cutting through space, moved forward. A signal came through on all frequencies, so powerful it made their screens flicker. "Beings of Earth," a deep voice echoed through their ship. "We are the Dominion. Your species has been observed and found wanting. Your continued existence threatens the proper order of spacetime. Surrender now, and your death will be quick." James gripped his control panel tighter. "Tom, what are we dealing with?" "Their ships are perfect," Tom replied, amazement in his voice. "Every angle, every system. They're built to match exactly with the laws of physics. No wasted energy, no inefficient designs. They're like machines made from mathematical equations. The enemy ships spread out in an attack pattern that looked more like an art piece than a military formation. Their movements were precise, calculated, perfect. "You have 10 minutes to surrender," the Dominion voice announced. "We have conquered 1,000 worlds. None could stand against our perfect designs, our absolute understanding of the universe's laws." James looked at his crew through the internal cameras. "What do you think?" "Their ships are incredible," Tom said. "But they're also predictable. They can only work the way physics says they should work." Alice smiled slowly. "And we have a ship that doesn't care what physics thinks." James nodded. "Send them our answer." The Dominion received their response, not in words, but in action. The impossible ship surged forward, moving in ways that made the enemy commander's perfect calculations meaningless. They fired weapons that should have destroyed anything in their path, but the paper-thin hull simply ignored the laws of energy and matter. "Impossible," the Dominion commander's voice boomed. "Your ship's design violates 47 fundamental laws of physics. It cannot exist." James guided their ship through the enemy formation, watching as their perfect tactics fell apart. The Dominion ships tried to predict where they would be, but their ship could be anywhere, or everywhere, at once. "They don't understand," Tom said excitedly. "Their whole civilization is built on following rules. They've never imagined breaking them." A Dominion blast passed through their ship without effect. Their impossible vessel replied by simply suggesting to reality that 2 Dominion ships should be somewhere else. And they were, their perfect formation scattered. "This cannot be." The Dominion commander's voice had lost its certainty. "We have mastered the laws of physics." "That's your problem," James replied to the open channel. "You think mastering laws means following them. Humanity learned long ago that true mastery means knowing when to break the rules." The impossible ship danced between enemy vessels, its very existence making their perfect universe increasingly chaotic. Dominion ships crashed into each other as their calculations failed, their sensors unable to handle a ship that could ignore the basic rules of space and time. "Retreat." The command echoed through space as the Dominion fleet tried to escape. Their perfect formations broke apart as each ship fled in a different direction. As the enemy disappeared back into fold space, James looked at his crew's faces on the screens. They had just proved that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in following rules, it was in daring to break them. But he knew this was just the beginning. The Dominion wouldn't give up easily. They would return with bigger fleets, stronger weapons, more perfect formations, and humanity would need to be ready. The Dominion returned 3 days later. Their fleet darkened the space around Neptune like a swarm of metal insects. 100 ships, then 1,000, then more, appearing in perfect geometric patterns that turned space itself into a work of deadly art. Earth's defense fleet looked tiny in comparison. 50 ships gathered near Neptune's orbit, the best humanity could muster on short notice. Captain James watched from his impossible ship as the human vessels formed their lines, knowing they were about to face something beyond their experience. "The Dominion fleet is still growing," Alice reported from her station. "They're using Neptune's gravity to amplify their weapons' power. The calculations are beautiful in a terrifying way." Tom's voice came through the speakers. "They've learned from our last meeting. Their ships are generating overlapping fields that should prevent our reality-bending tricks. Should being the key word." The Dominion's message boomed through space again. "Your defiance cannot continue. We have calculated every possible outcome. Your defeat is certain. Even your impossible ship cannot stand against the fundamental laws of mathematics." James watched as the enemy fleet arranged itself into a perfect sphere around the human ships. Their formation used Neptune's gravity, solar wind, and even the quantum fluctuations of space to create a trap that nothing should escape. "All human ships," James broadcast to the Earth fleet, "stay behind us." The impossible ship moved forward, alone against an empire that had conquered 1,000 worlds. The Dominion opened fire, their weapons synchronized to create a web of energy that would tear apart anything it touched. But the impossible ship had other ideas about what could and couldn't be torn apart. Where the Dominion expected destruction, the ship simply chose to be undamaged. Where their calculations said nothing could pass, it created paths that shouldn't exist. It phased through solid energy beams, split into mirror images that attacked from multiple directions, and turned the enemy's perfect formation against itself. How? The Dominion commander's voice shook with rage. Our calculations are perfect. That's not how humanity works, James replied as his ship danced through their defenses. We don't look for perfect solutions. We look for impossible ones, and then we make them work anyway. The impossible ship moved faster, each maneuver making less sense than the last. It treated the laws of physics like polite suggestions, turning the Dominion's greatest strength into their biggest weakness. Their perfect formations fell apart as they tried to adapt to something that couldn't be predicted. Now, James ordered. The Earth fleet surged forward through the gaps the impossible ship had created. The Dominion's perfect sphere had become a perfect trap. For themselves, their ships crashed into each other, trying to react to attacks that came from directions their calculations said were impossible. Their formation is breaking, Alice called out. They can't maintain their mathematical perfection. Tom laughed from engineering. Hard to do math when reality stops making sense. The impossible ship accelerated again, moving in ways that hurt to look at. It left trails of possibility in its wake, turning space itself into a maze of paradox. Dominion ships fired at targets that were both there and not there, their perfect weapons useless against something that ignored the rules they were based on. The Battle of Neptune lasted less than an hour. When it ended, the greatest fleet the Dominion had ever assembled fled in disorder, their perfect equations shattered by a single ship that should not have existed. James looked at the damage reports, or rather, the lack of them. Their ship hadn't taken a single hit, not because it was strong, but because it had simply decided that damage wasn't interesting enough to bother with. They'll be back, Alice said quietly. With even more ships, even better calculations. Let them come, James replied. They're still trying to win by following rules. And that's the one thing our ship will never do. In the quiet days after the Battle of Neptune, Tom spent every waking moment studying the impossible ship. Its secrets had kept humanity safe, but understanding them might be the key to survival. He sat in the engine room, surrounded by holographic displays showing data that shouldn't exist. Found anything? James asked, floating through the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. The artificial gravity worked differently every day, as if the ship was experimenting with new ways to ignore physics. Tom took a cup, his eyes never leaving the displays. I think I finally understand what we're dealing with. This ship wasn't built to be strong. It was built to make strength meaningless. He pointed to one of the screens, where complex patterns shifted and flowed. Look at these engine readings. They're not trying to push against physics. They're looking for loopholes. Gaps in reality where the rules don't quite connect. Like finding holes in a fence instead of climbing over it, James said, watching the patterns move. Exactly. Tom's eyes lit up. And the hull. It's not actually thin. It's uncertain. When something hits it, the ship just suggests to reality that maybe the hit happened somewhere else, or sometime else, or maybe it never happened at all. Alice joined them, carrying her own research notes. That's why the Dominion hates it so much. Their whole empire is built on using the laws of physics perfectly. But this ship doesn't try to use the laws. It looks for ways around them. Tom brought up more displays, showing the ship's internal systems. I found old data in the computer. This ship was built during the resource wars, but not by either side. A group of scientists realized that building bigger weapons wasn't the answer, so they tried something different. They built a ship that breaks the rules, James said. No, Tom shook his head. They built a ship that proves the rules aren't as solid as we think. Every flaw in its design is actually a carefully engineered paradox. The thin hull creates quantum uncertainty. The weird engine placement tears little holes in space-time. Even the computer runs on logic that exists between yes and no. Alice studied the patterns. But who built it? And why leave it hidden in that old shipyard? The data is damaged, Tom replied. But I found some messages. The scientists knew their invention would change everything. But they also knew humanity wasn't ready. We needed to learn to think differently first. To see that sometimes the best solution isn't to be stronger or faster. It's to question why we need strength and speed at all. James touched the nearest wall, feeling the ship hum under his fingers. And now we need that lesson more than ever. The Dominion thinks they're perfect because they follow every rule. But that's not what makes humanity special. We're special because we break rules. Alice asked. We're special because we ask why the rules exist, Tom said. This ship doesn't just ignore physics. It questions everything we think we know about how the universe works, and then it finds another way. The ship's sensors suddenly lit up with new alerts. The Dominion was moving again, gathering an even larger fleet. But this time, they didn't feel afraid. They'll come with better weapons, Alice said. Better calculations, better everything. Let them, James smiled. They're still playing by the rules. And now we know why our ship works, because it doesn't play at all. Tom closed his displays. The old scientists left us one more message. They said the ship's greatest weapon isn't its technology. It's the idea behind it. The idea that rules exist to be questioned, that impossible is just another word for hasn't been tried yet. The ship hummed louder, as if agreeing. In its own strange way, it was teaching humanity a lesson that would change them forever. Sometimes the best way to win isn't to be the strongest. It's to be the one who thinks differently. The impossible ship slipped through space like a dream through sleeping thoughts. Behind it came 30 Earth vessels, each one modified with the beginnings of impossible technology. They weren't as strange as the original ship, but they had learned to bend a few rules of their own. Approaching Dominion space, Alice announced from her station. The stars ahead look different here, arranged in patterns too perfect to be natural. The Dominion had spent millennia adjusting their star systems into mathematical perfection. James watched the sensor readings as they passed the border markers. Any sign they spotted us? Hard to tell, Tom replied from engineering. Their sensors work on pure logic. Our ship runs on imagination. As far as their systems are concerned, we don't exist. They had been traveling for 2 weeks, pushing deeper into enemy territory. Every world they passed showed signs of the Dominion's obsession with perfect order. Planets moved in exact circles. Moons hung in positions calculated to the millimeter. Space itself seemed afraid to move wrong. The first Dominion patrol appeared exactly where their calculations said it should be. The impossible ship didn't bother hiding. It simply suggested to reality that it might be more interesting if the patrol's sensors looked somewhere else. 5 systems liberated, Alice reported, marking another star cluster on their map. The Dominion's grip was weaker than we thought. Their subject worlds were waiting for a chance to break free. James nodded. Hard to control people when you can only think in straight lines. They found their first real resistance at a major Dominion shipyard. 100 enemy ships arranged themselves in a perfect defensive sphere, their weapons synchronized to cover every possible angle of attack. Every possible normal angle, that is. The impossible ship moved through spaces that weren't quite there, followed by Earth's fleet sliding through the gaps it created. Reality rippled around them as they ignored the basic rules of combat. Ships couldn't attack from 4 directions at once, except when they did. Weapons couldn't pass through solid matter, until they decided to try it. Their formations are breaking, Tom called out as the Dominion fleet tried to adapt. They keep trying to predict where we'll be, but we're not anywhere their math says is possible. World after world fell, or rather, rose up as the impossible ship showed them that rules could be broken. The Dominion's perfect empire started cracking along lines they had never calculated, its strength broken by the power of imagination. Main capital system ahead, Alice reported after another week of victories. They gathered everything they have left. 10,000 ships, arranged in, well, it's either a defensive pattern or the universe's most complicated art project. James smiled. The Dominion still hadn't learned. They were still trying to win by having the biggest fleet, the strongest weapons, the most perfect formations. They still didn't understand that none of that mattered against a ship that ignored the rules. All Earth ships, he broadcast to their fleet. Remember what we learned. Don't try to be stronger. Don't try to be faster. Just be impossible. The impossible ship led the charge, diving into spaces that couldn't exist. Reality bent around it like light through a prism, creating paths that the Earth fleet followed. The Dominion's perfect formation tried to adjust, but their computers crashed trying to calculate attacks against ships that were everywhere and nowhere. Their flagship is sending a message, Alice said as the battle turned into beautiful chaos. The Dominion commander's voice shook with confusion. How? Our calculations were perfect. Our weapons were perfect. Our strategy was perfect. That's why you lost, James replied as their ships danced through the enemy fleet. You tried to be perfect in a universe that runs on imagination. And against imagination, perfection doesn't stand a chance. 1 year after the impossible ship first emerged from that abandoned lunar shipyard, James stood at a window on Earth's main space station, watching ships come and go. Some moved normally, following the old rules of physics. Others seemed to flicker and dance, using the new technologies that the impossible ship had inspired. The Dominion's surrender is official, Alice said, joining him at the window. Their leaders finally accepted that perfect order isn't the only way to exist in space. Tom walked up with 3 cups of coffee that somehow stayed full, no matter how much they drank. One of the smaller tricks they'd learned from studying the impossible ship. They're already starting to change. Some of their scientists have begun experimenting with impossible math. Turns out even the most rigid minds can learn to bend. Below them, Earth glowed like a blue jewel. But it was different now. The old scientists' dream had spread, changing not just their ships but their whole way of thinking. Buildings rose that ignored gravity. Transport systems used spaces that weren't quite real. Even their computers had learned to think in ways that went beyond simple yes and no. Any word from the exploration teams? James asked, watching a new ship testing its impossible engines. Alice nodded. The deep space crews are finding things we never imagined. Turns out when you stop believing in limits, the universe gets a lot bigger and stranger. They've found worlds that exist in multiple places at once, spaces between spaces, even things we don't have words for yet. And the impossible ship? Tom asked quietly. James smiled. Their original ship, the one that had started it all, sat in a special dock nearby. It had grown even stranger over the past year, as if inspired by humanity's growing imagination. Sometimes it seemed to vanish completely, only to reappear with new secrets to share. It's teaching us, James said, not just about technology, but about possibilities. Every time we think we understand it, it shows us something new, something impossible. A group of children ran past their window, laughing as they played with toys that phased through walls and changed shape at will. They had grown up with impossible things, and to them, nothing seemed out of reach. The old scientists were right, Tom said, watching the children play. We weren't ready for this ship before. We needed to learn to question everything we thought we knew, to see rules as guidelines, not limits. And now? Alice asked. Now we're ready to really explore. James touched the window, feeling the strange energies that flowed through even simple things now. The Dominion thought they were perfect because they mastered the laws of physics. We became stronger because we dared to ask why those laws existed in the first place. Through the window, they watched as their impossible ship suddenly lit up, its hull shifting with new patterns they had never seen before. It was calling to them, ready for another adventure. "Where should we go next?" Alice asked, already excited for their next mission. James smiled. The old map stopped at the edge of known space, said, "Here there be impossible things." But that's not a warning anymore. It's an invitation. The three of them walked toward their ship, passing more children playing with impossible toys, more scientists working on impossible theories, more dreamers building impossible futures. Their ship had changed everything, not by being the strongest or the fastest, but by showing them that impossible was just another word for not tried yet. As they prepared for their next journey, James looked at his crew, his friends, and felt the ship hum with possibilities around them, ready to do something impossible. They laughed together, knowing that whatever they found out there in the strange new universe, it would never be as amazing as that first discovery, that the rules only limited you if you let them.